Well, to talk more about that, we're joined by Norman Rule, a former official at the US National Security Council and the Department of State. He's currently senior advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project and United Against Nuclear Iran. Thank you very much indeed for being with us tonight. Now, break it down for us. What's in it for Moscow? What's in it for Tehran? What are the two sides hoping to get out of a stronger relationship?
Good evening to you and to your viewers. Minister Abdullahian's visit to Tehran accomplishes three primary goals that are fundamental to Iranian foreign policy. First, for Iran and for Russia, you want to split multilateral coalitions that might be forming against it. And for Russia, the Iran card is something it can play against the United States, and also to play to ensure that the U.S. doesn't become too strong in the region if American and Russian relations were ever to come together. So Iran is likely going to achieve this. Secondly, you have the issue of the Iran nuclear negotiations. For the Iranians, they will return eventually because it's in their interest to do so, but they won't want to return until they can ensure that the U.S. is weakened, that Russia and China are on its side, and that the likelihood of snapback is off the table. Russia, again, supports this in general. And finally, Iran is going to be looking to enhance its relationship with Russia, China, and in the Caucasus as it deals with the new security environment in the wake of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Russia would want Iran's cooperation in this regard. So there are benefits for each party in a tighter relationship, but the bottom line is this is not going to constrain Iran's malign regional behavior. It will not constrain Iran's adventurism. It will place only the constraints in the Iran nuclear deal on Iran's nuclear program, which many people complain of.
Right, well, quite. And the Russians mentioned the nuclear deal today. If Iran manages to win over enough powerful friends, do they even need to return to the negotiations with the United States?
Well, they do. And I think Iran has really, as I stated, several goals in the talks. But one of the talks is they want to ensure that there is in essence, a different weight in the discussions. Normally, you would want to have the international community against Iran, bringing them back to the table. Instead, you seem to have Iran dictating the pace of negotiations, which is quite an extraordinary turnaround. Iran will want to keep that momentum and during this time build up its nuclear program so that when it comes to the actual negotiations, it can use that buildup to push back against additional concessions on, say, conventional arms or missiles that it might attempt to use against Israel and other neighbors. So in the short term, I think we're going to see the continued negotiations by Iran with Russia and China to ensure that Russia and China don't push back against this strategy.
You touched on Afghanistan there, and of course, Russia and Iran were on the same side in Syria, propping up President al-Assad. How do you think they might seek to exploit the chaos in Afghanistan following the US withdrawal?
For Russia, its primary goals in Afghanistan are going to be to prevent the spread of militants coming north, the spread of refugees who might bring with them militants, and there's some counter-narcotics concerns as well. Other than that, there aren't a lot of Russian strategic interest in Afghanistan. For Iran, it's a different picture. Iran wants to not only prevent a hostile Sunni state on its border, a failed state on its border, a terrorist state on its border, but about 11% of Iran's trade in a relatively weak economy that it has goes to Afghanistan. So they're each going to seek ways to engage the Taliban, and I think we'll try to use that relationship to win influence with Kabul, and that's a bad thing for those people who want to push back against the Taliban-al-Qaeda relationship.
Should the US be concerned about this relationship, and should the US respond?
Well, the United States should certainly do what it can to ensure that there is stability in Afghanistan sufficient to the point that we can bring in humanitarian aid, COVID-19 relief, and counterterrorism capacities of some sort. But we should be concerned about this. And I think a main concern that we should all have is what happens to the al-Qaeda operatives that Iran has under the loosest of possible detention, and in some cases no detention at all, who are operating from Iran itself. If they return to Afghanistan and they create an operational cell, not a global leadership cell, will the world be able to identify this in time to thwart any operations? And we should note that among those detained in Tehran is a man who was seeking a nuclear and biological weapons capability for al-Qaeda prior to 2001.